Yes, as I said, this is the second in our series on our Safe System Capacity Survey. Last week, we introduced the findings to many of you. Hopefully, many of you will have seen that. And so this week, we're having a panel discussion to really explore the implications of those findings. And then next week, there'll be a kind of a what next webinar. So just to kick off with a little bit of housekeeping, we have a new Q&A button, which Steve has shared in the chat. If you can use that for questions, it just makes it a little bit easier for me to monitor. However, it's a really new feature, so if all else fails, please do use the chat function as normal, but if we can try and use Q&A, that would be great. And obviously, if there's conversations you want to have amongst yourselves as we're going along, please use that chat function and engage with one another. So I kind of wanted to start off with a little bit of context about the Safe System Capacity Survey. As you will have heard last week, we really wanted to go out to the sector and understand where people were with safe system thinking and safe system application. So just to thank some of our partners who really helped us with this survey, we had PACTS, who David was on the panel last week, IHE, Road Safety GB, CIHT, this is my long list, RoadSafe, Adept, and Mark is here or is having a few technical problems, but is hopefully going to join us. RAC Foundation with Liz, Road Safety Foundation Suzy, and IAM Road Smart. We're also being joined by George today, and I'll do some introductions in a moment. Actually, I wanted to thank those partners as well who helped us with the survey design. Both Liz and Suzy cast a critical eye over our questions and helped us bring it together. So thank you very much for all of that. So before we kick off, I think it would just be useful to kind of go round and do a little bit of an introduction. So shall we start with you, Suzy? Kind of introduce yourself and kind of your role in helping the sector with safe system thinking, really.
Thanks, Tanya. So I'm Suzy Charman. I'm the Executive Director at the Road Safety Foundation. We're a charity that's been around since the 1980s. And in the last 20 years, we've really focused in on safe road infrastructure and promoting the safe system. And some of you will know us from our annual crash risk mapping work that looks at the performance of the network over the years, and also from the work that we do with the IRAP methodology, which is looking at a proactive risk assessment of road infrastructure and bringing about the sort of safe system through recommendations of treatments that we know will reduce the potential for facing serious injury on our roads.
Great, thank you. Liz, can I come to you now, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tanya. Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Box. I'm the Research Director at the RAC Foundation. For those of you who haven't come across us before, we're an independent charity and we do research and we disseminate findings of that research in all areas of transport policy. So road safety, environmental, economic and mobility issues. Obviously, we do quite a lot of work in road safety. It's the area I tend to focus on. My background is as a transport planner, so it's quite interesting to kind of see the findings of the survey and sort of think back to the time when I was working in a local authority situation and see how things have changed and think how things haven't. I've also got a background, but working in behavioural psychology at the moment, doing sort of PhD research, particularly thinking about education, which I think has come out quite strongly in the survey as well. So yeah, looking forward to having a discussion with everybody this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. George, can I come to you now, please?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm George Henry. I'm National Operations Manager for Road Safety and Policy and Education at Transport Scotland, Scottish Government. So I joined the team 4 years ago, basically to oversee us meeting the old road safety framework to 2020, to which we met our targets on that. At the same time as developing our new road safety framework to 2030 with our long-term vision for 2050 within Scotland. Prior to that, I headed up the road policy team dealing on a variety of different policy measures. And before that, I'd spent around 15 years in road safety. So it's nice to be back. Exciting times ahead, I suppose, albeit challenging at the same time.
Great, thank you. And I think getting your perspective from the Scottish perspective on some of this is going to be really interesting. Mark, have we managed to get you in with your tech? Here we are, brilliant.
I'm doing the best I can. Apologies, my computer is causing me all sorts of trouble. So I'm Mark Kemp. I'm president of Adept and chair of the UK Network Management Board, which has road safety in its remit.
Wonderful, thank you, Mark. Well, chip in as you kind of as you can. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of spend a couple of minutes kind of recapping what we found in the survey, just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So we had 129 completions, an additional 169, which were from people who didn't belong to one of the organisations that we stipulated. We were really focusing on those who have a kind of a statutory or duty or embedded responsibility to deliver on road safety. I think what this has taught us is that there are an awful lot of other actors who are in the system, who are really interested in participating and giving their views on safe systems. So round 2 next year will probably mean that we ought to go out and understand what those roles of the NGOs, the charities, and those other organisations really is. The majority who participated this year, though, tended to be from local authorities, and they were either managers or road safety officers. And as Liz said, a really major area of focus for all of those who participated, be it local authority, police or fire, was road safety education. It came out time and again that this is where a major focus was. But analysis, engineering, management, working on schemes and bids came out across the different organisations. It was really encouraging to see that actually a large majority of respondents either have or are developing a road safety strategy, although some were admitting that they don't always adhere to it, and there's not necessarily always an implementation plan that sits alongside those strategies. So it's great to have the thing on the shelf, but actually how do you deliver? And I think this is something that will probably come up a little bit today. Really encouraging that almost half have adopted a Vision Zero goal, and 40% have got 50% targets for 2030 to reduce deaths and serious injuries, so have adopted that UN target. And about 20% have safety performance indicators. Most tended to be part of a partnership, which again, if we're thinking safe system and the roles of many different organisations, then that's super encouraging. And we found actually that collaboration and communication with their partnering areas were really positive. One area which was really quite mixed was to do with funding, whereas most organisations were experiencing both reductions in capital and revenue funding over the last 5 years. I think something probably we're going to touch on quite a bit today is the common frustrations from those who responded to the survey. Lack of funding, lack of support from government, lack of strategic guidance, and limited time and resources did come up for many of them. And I think, kind of related to the topic we're on today, actually, there was quite a mixed picture in terms of safe system understanding. There was those who admitted actually to having very little or no understanding at all, whereas others kind of seemed to demonstrate. We gave 200 words of free text. What does safe system mean to you? And we got some really beautiful essays that that kind of explained fully, kind of showed that there was a really strong understanding for some, whereas others it's quite a new concept. So yeah, I think that's probably enough to kind of touch on whilst we're to kind of recapping last week. So I suppose one kind of my first question to you as a panel really is, are the results as you expected? In fact, Liz, you kind of touched on that, things that changed and things that haven't. Yeah, are the results as you expected? And if there were findings you didn't expect, what did you think you were going to see instead? Where should we begin? Liz, thinking back, going back to your previous experiences, how do you reflect on that?
Yes. Oh, well, that was a long time ago now. I left a local authority situation in 2006. So I would hope a lot has changed. But firstly, Tanya, thanks to you and the Agilisys team for putting together the survey and running it. I think it was a really good time to go out to the sector post-COVID, just to kind of find out where the land lie. And I think that's really helpful. So thanks for all of that work you've put in. In terms of were the results what I was expecting? In many ways, I think they were. There weren't a huge number of surprises. I think the one big surprise, and I know we're going to talk about this probably a lot later, is that the percentage of the respondents from all different groups that said that education was their priority area, sort of 80% saying that that's the case. And that predominant focus is a little bit surprising. I suppose in itself that brings us a few challenges, doesn't it? Because, you know, therefore we've got quite a lot of people spending a lot of time in the sector on an area where we know there's no national standards, there's no national guidelines, and there's no sort of systematic structure in which people are working. So I think that provides a massive challenge for the sector, that if people are to continue working so heavily in that field, and obviously there's a huge number of questions about the role of education and what value it can provide and how it's done. But how can we have so many people working without a kind of a structure within which to work? If you think about all of the other areas, whether it be road engineering or even if you're thinking about speed management, they've got really consistent structures and standards and best practice in place. I mean, you know, Suzy can talk all about all the excellent work that's been done on safer roads, and that's really permeating throughout the sector. So can we kind of get something a little bit more like that going in education? I think that was, to me, what came up as surprising, but kind of needing action as well.
Perfect. Oh, there's loads we can pick apart there, Liz, and I think we probably will come back to that in a little while. George, what about your reflections on what we found?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Liz said, probably not anything too surprising. We had done a fair bit of consultation with our kind of key partners and stakeholders when developing our road safety framework to 2030. So there was a fair bit of that came out, really highlighted the fact that there's a lot of people working in industry don't really know about the safe system, and while some had knowledge of it, didn't really know, you know, how the implementation process is of that. And I think that ultimately what we found in Scotland from that is that I think people were starting to get bamboozled by it a lot more, whereas sometimes we're not asking people to make significant change in the way that they do their job, but it's more how they liaise across various teams within their organisations and how we put those layers in place and have other people out with road safety thinking about the job that they're doing in road safety within that. So I think that that's been one of the key things. Again, to echo what Liz was saying, quite interested to find out that education has came out so much. Probably need to dig a little bit deeper. Is that lifelong learning? Is it purely around the education within schools? Because whilst we are updating all our resources in Scotland at the moment to make sure that they're fit for purpose, up to date, we know, whilst we try and align it with the curriculum of excellence within Scotland, we know that it's not mandatory, and trying to get teachers to actually implement it within classrooms is important. One of the big things is that while school kids are only at school for a certain level of time, what are we doing as parents or out with the classroom for learning in terms of road safety is something that we're considering. But also, I think that what we're finding in terms of driver behaviour, you know, coming out of the pandemic, it's clear that maybe there is some education that needs to go for drivers as well. And what we're finding, older road users particularly be more prevalent in terms of collisions now as well. We maybe need to look at the kind of the lifelong learning, looking at some of the older age groups as well, and that's something that we're kind of keen to maybe explore a bit further as well there.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, obviously the survey is who responded, and so whether or not it was appealing more to those who are in the education arm of road safety, I don't know. Any thoughts, Suzy, from your perspective on your kind of who was involved and how we kind of engage with those who are more in the engineering element?
Yeah, so the first question was, am I surprised? And actually, I was quite surprised at how positive the responses were, and it made me question about the potential response bias. So are we actually getting responses in a survey about safe system from people who actually know what that is in the first place? So I do wonder about how we reach those who are perhaps not quite as engaged as they might be, and equally, as you say, I think that, I mean, this should never be about setting engineering versus education versus enforcement and so on. I do wonder sometimes about our understanding of the system as a whole and whether we're actually understanding what a safe system looks like and is. Lots of people refer to the safe system approach or safe system this or safe systems. I have Jean Breen sort of sitting beside me in my ear saying, you can't say that. She's the founding sort of parent, if you like, of safe system. She'd be saying, no, the safe system is a system. It isn't an approach. It's not that you take a bit and you go on doing safe systems. We're talking about actually implementing a system within which death and serious injury can't happen. That is ultimately what a safe system is. And it's whether people really appreciate what that is. And I think from my specialism, I'm normally thinking about safe road infrastructure and speeds, because they kind of go hand in hand. You can't really disentangle them, because a safe system is where the speeds of operation are absolutely marry well and are appropriate for the road environment and what it can support to prevent death and serious injury. And from my perspective, I'm quite surprised that we haven't had more on that in the survey. But as you say, we may not have reached our target audience quite so well, or actually it may be still quite new. Although we've been doing bits of work in this area for some time now, we're still only touching on a handful of authorities in our work. In terms of education, I think we need to reframe things a bit, because when you talk about education from a system point of view, it becomes a bit different, and there are different levers that we can apply than sort of traditional road safety education activities, if that makes sense. And Liz will be much more specialist at this than I am, and Tanya. But I think we need to just reframe all of the stuff that we think is safe system and just have another look at it afresh, if that makes sense. Sorry, a bit rambly, but
yeah, that's all really good. And actually, Tim in the Q&A has touched on the same thing about the biases response. So does the bias towards education in the responses perhaps demonstrate that those involved in education are more likely to have been engaged in the survey than those from the engineering side? And I think perhaps that positive bias that we're seeing, it could be part of that as well. We had a lot of people who attempted the survey and didn't complete it. Is that because it became scary? I'd love to find out from those who didn't go as far as completing all of the questions. Was it too onerous? I mean, anybody out there, any feedback you want to send us, then please do, because actually understanding everybody's views is really important, not just those who kind of agree with us. Mark, any reflections from you on the findings?
Yeah, thank you. And technology seems to be sorted out now, so
yay.
Hey, I think really interesting listening to the others. I kind of I hear what they say in terms of what's come through. And as I was looking at it, I was wondering about I'm not going to call them silos because that's unfair, but the different bits of the operation that make up a road safety team in the good old days. And and in reality, and I'll put my hand up as an engineer by profession, engineers like to compartmentalize things. Educationalists probably work a bit more broadly. So I'm just wondering whether some of the reasons we've got the responses we've got is actually around the mindset of the people who are already in the mix. So my education people are always trying to find ways of working with others and levering other bits of system to help them deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. My engineers have a scheme they've got to deliver, and once they've delivered their scheme, they're looking for their next scheme to deliver. So in reality, it may just be a reflection of the sorts of people that we are that enables us to do the job we do. I'm absolutely not decrying what my engineers do; they're brilliant. But it's just a different mindset, isn't it? And I wonder whether that's part of it.
That's really interesting, and actually we've been doing some work on culture and safe system culture and how we might think across those silos, so they're no longer silos, and we're actually all talking the same language regardless of what our role is. So that's really interesting, Mark. So coming back to some of the positives that Suzy, you just mentioned, I mean, we've got strong commitments from those who responded in terms of their strategies and Vision Zero goals, targets. Actually, 20% said they had safety performance indicators, which is really positive. And there's a real desire to embed safe system thinking and increase capacity. So What should we be doing to harness these positives and help this wider sector to deliver on them? Does anybody want to kind of jump in on there? Oh, battle between the
battle. So
Go
from
on,
my
you go, Suzy.
perspective, what we don't have yet is something really tangible, something really kind of replicable. And for me, that would probably be a view of, here's an example of a safe system implemented in a village. Here's a 5-star village. Here's a 5-star arterial road. Here's a 5-star motorway. Here's a 5-star rural road environment. So that people can actually see what that means. Because I think at the moment we're sort of kidding ourselves that by tweaking a few things we can make things safer. Well, that's not safe. That's not a safe system. That's a safer road. And I'm talking about roads deliberately because it's my area, so apologies for being blinkered. But for me, it then leads to a lot of really difficult discussions, mainly around speed, because actually we need to have that grown-up conversation about what our road infrastructure can safely support, what facilities we have in place and what speed that can support and what kind of movement that can support. Otherwise, we're kind of still working in the intangibles. And I would love to see, just to throw it out there, an annual award for a 5-star something or a safe system something, so that we can sort of start to promote that absolutely not just good practice, but really brilliant safe system practice that we need to see examples of, because we've got good practice all over the place. You know, our engineers are brilliant in this country, working with the resources that they have. But what we don't have is and here's where we really pushed the envelope and we did something a little bit different that meant that walking and cycling and vehicle occupants and horse riders and everybody can live absolutely secure, that there should be no death and serious injury on this stretch of road. We just don't have that example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's reflected in the fact that some of these people were saying that they have strategies, but they don't necessarily implement them and adhere to them all the time. And when we've spoken to people, I think, yeah, it's really easy to talk about following the principles, but actually doing and knowing what to do, where to start is tremendously difficult. Liz, you had your hand up and I can see then George is kind of wanting to jump in.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, Suzy, actually trying to get recognition and to kind of build up that understanding of what good looks like. I think it's really hard at the moment. And I think what kind of going back to your query around what was good about the strategies and the kind of the targets and all that side of things, like we've had a localism agenda for I don't know how many years now, for a long old time, and I think locally it's great to see a good job is being done in trying to make the best of understanding what the strategic direction looks like and how to take things locally. But the problem then is you've got a million different kind of strategies and approaches, and you know, transport is never you know, in one area on its own, is it? We move across different boundaries. So I think what I'd like to see building on that excellent work is the kind of collaboration piece. And I think that came across in the survey that not that many were collaborating as effectively as they could, even with their neighbours, let alone with other similar local authorities across the country that might have similar issues to them. So to what extent can those strategies, those kind of key performance indicators be shared so that you can reduce the duplication? I mean, this is all costing everybody something to put all this stuff together. Can we reduce that duplication and then kind of get best practice across those different areas? So great to see that there's a focus at the moment, but it feels a bit piecemeal. And, you know, we really need a national approach and strategy that everybody can then work with, but we don't have that at the moment. So in absence of that, I would say collaboration is kind of where we need to go for going forwards.
Wonderful, thank you. George, should I come to you? And then we've got quite a few questions which are turning up, so we'll kind of address those before moving on.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, again, speaking from a Scottish perspective, I suppose we're kind of different in the fact that we have our strategy in place. We have our targets. For the first time, we went with a full suite of mode and user specific targets, which are backed up by a number of indicators and measures that we're looking at. We also have added in a kind of third tier of governance to our structure, to which we didn't have previously, which comes in the way of local partnership forums to improve the kind of level of discussion between the national, regional and local levels. and the way that we take that forward. The one thing that we, and I think it's probably reflective right across the whole country, possibly the world, is that I suppose that we don't ever think that our resourcing and funding within the road safety field is probably adequate for when you look at, say, for example, the cost of fatalities in Scotland will be somewhere, to the Scottish Society, will be somewhere in the region of 300 and odd million alone this year. Whereas when you look at what we're actually spending specifically on road safety, that's minor compared to other areas. So I think that that collaboration thing is absolutely vitally important to ensure that it's not just about what road safety are spending on road safety and how we're delivering road safety. It's about what everybody else is doing. So if we're punting 300 million a year into active and sustainable travel, are they absolutely making sure that road safety is their primary thought process? And to touch on Suzy's thing, is that from our road safety improvement fund that we've put out, it was absolutely something that we wanted to see and that we're developing at this present moment in time, where certain local authorities taking an area-wide safe system scheme that puts everything in, that'll have a bit of innovation, that'll have a bit of something that we can evaluate there. And we're also looking at doing it on the trunk road network as well, so that we are trying to kind of build up good examples that we can then share across our safety groups within the country, and really kind of monitor the outcomes of that. Particularly one of the areas for us, again, speaking from a Scottish perspective, is we know that you're 3 times more likely to be involved in a collision if you live in an area of deprivation. So one of the areas that we're trying to get as local authority to choose an area of deprivation and try and lift that up, and show how all these different policy areas can work together and actually deliver real cross-cutting policy, rather than just say that's something that we do because it sounds good for a minister to say it or someone in my position to say it. What does it actually mean in practice? Go and show a good example of it and take that forward. Again, it does come down to kind of that will and funding and resourcing, and that's why we're really trying to kind of lead and push other partners in Scotland to come along on that journey with us, because we simply can't do it ourselves.
That's great. So yeah, collaboration is key. Mark?
Yeah, everything, totally agree with everything that George says, as usual. But I think, I think this idea that we have a road safety budget is almost a challenge in its own right, in that it mentally makes people think about that's where road safety is being done. My teams all know we're all about getting everybody around everywhere as safely as possible, whether we're filling a pothole or replacing the white lining or putting in a scheme. It's about making sure people are able to travel safely. And I think you need to get people thinking, as George says, in a more holistic way across the whole of their service. I suppose the one thing that I'd also say, so one challenge is, do we shoot ourselves in the foot by saying we've got a road safety budget, as opposed to my whole budget is about road safety. Second thing is, it's really, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's really quite easy for me to get a strategic document signed off. People are quite happy to sign off to something very nice, motherhood and apple pie, absolutely agree that all these things should be done. When you actually get to dealing with it at the local level and trying to implement the thing, that's when you start to get the challenges. So having back to Suzy's point, I think, when you've got enough data and evidence to help local councillors defend putting things in that the vocal minority find unpopular, is probably one of the big things. We almost need a toolbox of bits of evidence from people that show how and why doing this thing has had a marked improvement on road safety, etc., in that locality.
Really interesting. Okay, and actually related to that, we have a few questions in the Q&A. So before we move on, let's touch on those. So let me just get this to work. So Simon asked about that 5-star village concept. Suzy, how would the road users travelling through a village behave as 5-star drivers if they've never been there before and have received no education or enforcement in that?
So a 5-star village would probably have a mixture of a bit of speed management. I think you couldn't really get away from that. You need to have facilities for walking and cycling that were commensurate with the vehicle speeds in that environment. And really, I think what we've been starting to see is that sort of primacy given to walking and cycling over motorised vehicle use in urban spaces, but in villages we haven't seen that quite so readily, particularly rural villages. How would we expect them to behave correctly and comply with perhaps lower speed limits than have been there previously? Well, I think that is all about the national approach and having I'm really interested to see what happens in Wales with the urban 20 mph default speed limit for urban environments, because my psychology background is telling me that as soon as you have consistency, as soon as you have that, well, this becomes the norm. This is what we expect to do when there are people walking and cycling around us. We expect to slow down and so on and so forth. When you start to get that consistency and everybody pulling in the same direction, dare I say it, whereas what we have is quite piecemeal, I think, in England, I think you then do get that greater opportunity to see that level of compliance, and that sort of self-explainingness of the road environment becomes inherent because you've got that national drive. Everybody's moving the same direction and everybody starts to respect and understand that that's what we expect of people. I kind of think that 20s will become the drink driving of the future, that, you know, when drink driving laws were introduced, people really didn't like them at all, did they? And didn't like to comply. But actually, it's now socially completely unacceptable to be driving and drinking. So my hope is that in time, as we get more and more 20s and lower speed limits through those sorts of settings, that we'll see that acceptance that that's what you do to be a good social human being.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And just related to consistency, Tim's asked, would it be beneficial to run training for the engineering side to help to get a single methodology for a safe system? In response to that, Simon said, well, actually, most or all road safety auditors will have done the excellent 2-week ROSPA course. So is it actually about, but the training is only good if there's money to deliver engineering intervention. So is it about funding, or is it about training? Is it a combination of the two in terms of kind of helping the sector to deliver? Any thoughts on that?
If I could come in, Tanya, I think training is absolutely fundamental. I think that when we looked at what was happening, safe system, even Scandinavian countries been putting this in for a number of years, and the way that they implemented it and the likes, when we actually went to discuss it with them, there was very little in terms of, oh, here's how we actually did it, or here's what we changed, and here's how we do it. And again, reflecting on that 2-week ROSPA road safety course, why have we not got one for safe system now? Why have we not got something that's in place right across all areas, so that planners can do it, designers can do it, engineers can do it, educators can do it, teachers can do it? That's what we need. That's where we need to get to, and that's obviously something that we're looking at trying to kind of break down those barriers and have something that is available to be rolled out to everyone. And even then, something that a road user can actually look at and go, okay, I understand where I am now in this part. I understand the role that I play, because, going back to the question that was asked of Suzy's, how does a driver become a 5-star driver? Well, I think that, there's a bit of personal responsibility there, where people should be adhering to the road rules and driving to conditions and all the rest of it. We know that it's difficult, and that's something that, coming on the back of COVID, that have people who used to drive a lot, like anything, if you golf 7 days a week, you'll probably get quite good at it. It's the same with driving. If we're not driving as many miles and we're not in the car as much, and I know that there's, as a government, we are trying to get people out of their cars and go modal shift and choose more sustainable ways of traveling, etc. But again, we need to kind of look at the way that people are actually behaving within their vehicles, and ultimately that comes down to the individual making decisions that either they shouldn't be or breaking the law or otherwise. So I think that we need to put a bit of more personal responsibility back on road users as well. It's not just about how engineering and education can fix this. They've got the biggest part to play, to be perfectly honest with you.
Great, and I can see Suzy with her hand up there to respond.
Yeah, I just I wonder sometimes about this whole personal responsibility thing, because I think people are really poor at understanding risk. And I think that, you know, do people realise that when they're travelling along a single carriageway road and it's tree lined, for example, that if they hit that tree above 40, 45, that they're probably very seriously injured or dead? I don't think people know that. I don't think people really get that. So for me, it's incumbent on those that own the system to be communicating about that, but also to be putting systems in vehicles, which are part of the safe system as well, to make sure that we do stuff that is sensible ultimately. Because there will be some people don't take that personal responsibility. We know that, you know, the frontal cortex of young men, for example, isn't developed enough to, you know, to take responsible sort of decisions. So we've got to put those systematic things in place to actually influence behaviour from the outset. And yeah, I don't know all the answers on that one. As a psychologist, I feel really uncomfortable because I genuinely have done a bit of soul searching on this. But actually, the one thing that we can do as system owners is treat the road so that if you have a crash, you're not fatally or seriously injured. Now, the whole compliance thing then becomes tricky, and the whole kind of speed limit stuff becomes tricky because most of our speed limits are not set at safe levels. So we just need to, you know, have a good old think about that one.
Great. Liz?
Yeah, I think just picking up on some of the, I mean, we're having such a wide-ranging discussion, aren't we, touching on so many things. But one of the things that you mentioned there, Suzy, I think what we really need to get our heads around, especially given so many people are focusing on education, is how education can be an enabler of the safe system. So is it actually much more about encouraging people to understand the reasons why we do things, as you were just talking about there? Do they understand why we make decisions on the road network? Is it to understand kind of why we have different rules in place for speeding and the like, and actually to increase acceptance of enforcement? So I think we need to think about education much more as a bit like enforcement. It kind of supports the system. We should not be expecting education to deliver anything on its own. I mean, Tanya knows this very well from all the studies that she's done, that, you know, largely speaking, you deliver something educational, you can expect very small, minor positive improvements if you're lucky, and they don't last very long. So, you know, if we're spending a huge amount of money on something that's not very effective and then doesn't last very long, we need to be questioning, well, actually, should we be putting much more of this into the things that we know that work, in terms of engineering improvements, in terms of, you know, speed management, enforcement, all of those sorts of things. And so, yeah, I guess it's a question of kind of priority and where we focus. And the point that Mark raised about, we must not just keep on thinking about road safety. I mean, I think in my short time in a transport department, you needed absolutely everybody in that whole department: the bridge engineers, the highways engineers, the transport modelers, the active travel team, and very few of them had safety in their job title, but they're absolutely crucial for kind of delivering that outcome. So unless we have all of those people on board, we're not going to get anywhere that we need to get to at all.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Mark, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts from me. I guess I'm reflecting on what Suzy said. You know, if the many years ago when I passed my driving test, 20 miles an hour had been the speed that we learned to drive in an urban area, 20 miles an hour would feel absolutely appropriate to me at the moment. And I think Suzy's quite right that we've got a whole load of people who have grown up with something, and you just can't switch it off overnight. It takes a long time, a lot of hard work. So the Wales experiment, I call it experiments at the moment, but the Wales work is really, really interesting, and I really hope that they're successful. So I think we need to have that, and then we need to think about geographically what is a reasonable amount of England. Because my fundamental belief, I'm currently fighting with a lot of my councils, because I think if you're going to make a change, you need to make it on a big geographical area. Just making it in small locations is not going to do the trick. So you need to think much bigger than perhaps we're thinking, and that may be a national thing rather than a local thing. And then I guess my final thing is, George will make some really, really good comments about the needs of the different skills and training people up. I think there's two ways to skin that cat. yes, absolutely give people the opportunity to do the courses. The other thing is about thinking what your team is made up of that's actually running the project, whatever the project is, and making sure you've got the right skills in the team. Not, you know, I am never going to profess to be anyone who has an expert or is an expert on behavioural science, but I absolutely know now that I need someone who understands behavioural science involved in the early stages of my programs, rather than me designing something, putting it on the ground, and then looking at it and wondering why people aren't using it. You know, it's we need to think about these things far more holistically than we perhaps have done in days gone by.
Great, thank you, Mark. George, you want to come back then?
Yeah, it was just one last thing. I know that as part of the kind of Spaces for People funding through COVID, Scottish Borders Council had put in 96 settlements, I think, that reduced all the 30-mile-an-hour speed limits down to 20, and then they're now making the majority of them permanent, or maybe shortening some of the lengths and stuff. And what they actually found was that, you know, compliance was actually really good, a lot better than what we probably envisaged it to be. And whilst we look at our national strategy for Scotland, leaving it in the hands of local authorities to make the right decisions within their areas, I think that, you know, certainly 20 miles per hour is the way forward, and the way that everybody's going. And I would, and like as Mark said, hope Wales get really good similar reductions in speeds, and it does become the norm, because I think that it aligns with so many other policy areas that it can only be seen as a positive. And particularly one of the big things that we're trying to influence in Scotland is kind of bus patronage and the services to be better than what they are in certain areas. Probably where I live in Edinburgh, we're blessed with a bus service that's pretty good. But in more of the kind of rural areas and urban developments and various different things, it ain't so good. But so I think that it's really important that when local authorities are choosing what roads should be reduced to kind of 20, is that we're really trying to complement other policy areas as well, moving forward.
Wonderful, thank you. I think some of this discussion kind of touches on one of the question from Stephen, which says, is it not about communicating the shared responsibility with users? ITF, when outlining safe system approach, highlights the public discourse. It's not about engaging with our transport users to understand their shared responsibility. Therefore, the public discourse is the step change in reframing our traditional approach and the risk of silo thinking, creating greater awareness of shared responsibility. In a political climate of reduced spending, the shared public discourse could be the most effective approach whilst preserving limited resources. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really, well, very eloquent comment there, that really sets out very well. I don't know quite how any of us can kind of add to that in some ways, but I think really what that goes on is kind of moving beyond our initial immediate environment, because we're all focused on delivering and putting things in there. And actually what that talks to is we know it's so hard to deliver something, because actually what influences people is their friends, it's their family, it's their immediate social environments, it's what they read, it's what they engage with. The amount of information that we're now bombarded with in society, how do we ever think as either road safety professionals or transport professionals we can almost compete with that? We used to talk about, well, car ads, you know, they're so flash, they've got a lot of money, they're going to influence people much more. I mean, we've got an even bigger issue now. So I think that's a really interesting concept to kind of think about how we can employ things broader than ourselves to actually help do a much bigger job that's much more present in everybody's day-to-day lives than a one-off course from us or a one-off experience they might have in terms of seeing something written down or going to a certain event or such like. So yeah, great idea. I don't know quite how you operationalize that and get to it, but I think it's a great sort of thing to aim for sure.
Great, thank you. Actually, you started touching on one of my other questions. So some results we didn't share in detail last week related to the safe system components and kind of how much practitioners operate across the safe system. And as we've already touched on, it was really clear that there were some areas they tended to focus on more than others. So the safe road use, safe speeds came up with enforcement. A few of the people involved were involved in kind of designing to to lower speeds, but not necessarily setting them. And obviously safe roads came up, but actually, you know, very few of them were undertaking road safety ratings, risk ratings of roads, or providing those integrated traffic management systems. And there was actually even less involvement in some of the actions detailed for post-collision response and safe vehicles. So given the funding restraints and perhaps some of the knowledge gaps that are potentially out there, are we expecting too much from local practitioners and partners if we want them to deliver in all areas of the safe system? And if that's the case, who else needs to be involved? Who else should we talking to, you know, and engaging with in this way to move forward? Suzy, I saw you nodding there.
Oh, I shouldn't have done that. So I wanted to just pick up on funding just very, very briefly. I really struggle with this because yes, there is finite money around. I do appreciate that, and I don't completely live in cloud cuckoo land, though partially I do. But actually, what we probably need to be better at as a community is saying what we need. You know, we want to deliver a safe system. For example, on the strategic road network, 0 death and harm by 2040. What do we need to get there? And I think some of the work that we've been doing at the foundation has been trying to sort of scope out what that investment looks like. You then go to a local authority and you say, have you got what you need? And they'll go, oh yeah. How much have you got? Oh, I've got 500,000 a year for a whole county. And you go, what you need? Can we just elevate the level of ambition here and at least tell everybody what we need? Yes, we're not going to get all of it, but let's just sort of say what the need is. But also then, as you say, who else needs to be involved? Central government, obviously. I mean, there's so much policy process, the whole way that you appraise schemes and all of that stuff, that doesn't have safe system thinking in it at the moment. It just simply is incompatible with delivery of a safe system. So the minute you start offsetting journey time versus speed limit changes, you're in trouble because the journey time always wins. It swamps all of the safety benefit you get from a speed limit change, even though we're trying to support modal shift and we're trying to get people comfortable with walking and cycling and so on and so forth. So we've got this other policy objective about modal shift and environmental impact and so on. And that's also not really being valued within the systems that we have and the policies and the appraisals and all of that stuff. So for me, it's about making sure that our modern transport values, the things that we hold dear, the stuff that's all about sustainable mobility, the stuff that's about safety, let's make sure that is actually reflected in our decision making and our policy, because it isn't. We've got a long journey to go through to get to that point, and we may as well just start that now. Setting local speed limits guidance, which isn't mandatory, but you know, that doesn't have safe system at the heart of it. That's all about set the speed limits according to 85th percentile, let everybody judge how fast the road should operate. No, I'd rather that actually had something about survivability at its heart and the sort of mobility that the road is meant to support. So what's the purpose and function of a road? If it's for cycling and walking, well, clearly we need to reduce the speed limit. End of story, regardless of journey time calculations in business cases and all of the other stuff. So yeah, I'm kind of all over the place here, but I think this whole modern transport values and getting those policies geared up to deliver them is absolutely critical to all of this. And it's not just about safety, it's about sustainability, it's about environmental impact and emissions and all of that stuff as well.
Fabulous, thank you. Liz.
Yeah, Suzy, I think that's absolutely spot on about the funding, and that was one of the key things that I was thinking through, and that funding's always a perennial issue. We're in public services, there's never going to be enough funding around. So, and I didn't get a sense of this in the survey actually. I think people were just reflecting what the reality was. I don't sense that people were kind of moaning about it, if you like. I think it's just a fact of life, a reality, and we're clearly going to go into much leaner times soon as well. So it's going to only become more of an issue. So what can we do about this? And that to me is very much kind of especially given safety is often something that's cut. If there's a budget that's reducing, safety often becomes a nice to have, which is awful. None of us on this call would agree with that. So I think it does come down to having those watertight business cases, actually looking at it very, very much of a business lens of actually proving what the value of your work is. And I think we're only going to get to that if we start to get really robust evidence about the effectiveness of some of these interventions that we're putting in place, which is what we're starting to see with the Safer Roads Fund, which Suzy and the team are running, because there's very clear evidence of you do this, you start to have these benefits, and therefore you can start to invest funding in it. So I think we kind of need to get there. And, obviously, local authorities, delivery partners, they're in a hugely challenging situation. They've got limited time. Sometimes they don't have all the knowledge they need or the resources to deliver what they want. And I think it came up earlier, actually, about having some worked examples of kind of not only the kind of task roles for different roles within the kind of safety system and what we should be looking to achieve and what's helpful to do and what's not, but also about kind of deliverable products. Are there particular things? Once it's designed, I hate the reinvention of the wheel. It drives me mad. I mean, once we've all been in the sector for long enough, you think, oh God, not again. Can't we just use what we've already learned? But then that comes down to a business model as well. People can't work for free. It's difficult for people to give away their products for free because they've put good time and effort into that. So how do we deal with that issue? And I think that has to be the pooling of public resources to come up with public resources that then can be shared. So we're not starting from scratch each time, because we've got a huge amount to build on. There's a great amount of expertise in this country that can be used. So I guess I share that frustration on kind of how can we move forward when it feels like we're repeating ourselves quite often. And I suppose it always comes back to, can we have some sort of national framework that allows us to slot into what resources we can get, what funding works, et cetera, because I think people are doing the very best they can in a very difficult situation right now, and a situation that's probably going to be getting worse given the funding situation we're in.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all the points that kind of Suzy and Liz have touched on. However, from going back to your question, are we expecting too much for local practitioners and partnerships to deliver a safe system in all areas? Absolutely not, because I don't think that unless certainly I see my role and kind of from a central government perspective as I've got to lead and we've got to inspire these people to kind of try and make the best of what we have to ensure that we can deliver right across all areas. If we go with a kind of piecemeal approach, then we're not going to be delivering the safe system properly, and we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. Again, I think the way that we do that, yes, we do deal with resourcing and finance issues. I'm undergoing the exact same myself at this present moment in time, like everybody else. But again, it's making sure you're maximising for what we spend. I don't think that we've ever been great, even although we quote cost to society and all the rest of it. I don't think that we've ever been great in kind of demonstrating, what we're spending in road safety and what we're actually saving and what we're delivering, on what we're delivering. And I think that that's important, that we really try and nail that, because I think that certainly in discussions that I've had with ministers of late, they've been horrified at the cost to society in Scotland with the rise in fatalities. So it seems to be landing in the right way now. And that's really what I think that we need to get across. But again, it comes back to that collaboration in various different areas. If we're pumping hundreds of millions into active and sustainable travel, let's make sure that road safety is fundamentally at the heart of their thinking before they even start. And it's really kind of drawn across all those funds to deliver with each other to make sure that we get the benefits.
Do you have private sector at the table in Transport Scotland in a safe system way? So Julian says here, so significant public infrastructure is provided through the private sector. Clearly, there's an issue where public sector wants the best infrastructure possible for all users. However, private sector developers want to provide as little as possible because there is a profit element there potentially. So how do we implement the systems approach into this area where we've got kind of these competing interests?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we've been discussing previously, particularly when it comes to some DBFO contracts and various different bits and pieces that have been there. For example, some of this, the A9 dueling, we've been having discussions on how they actually implement the safe system totally, right across the whole length of that route, and the way that it's upgrading, and particularly I think across some of the other private engineering firms and various different bits and people that we've had them working with, that we're continuing to say, this is our overarching policy, this is what must be complied with, and this is the way that we need to kind of work together to kind of achieve that. I'm not naive to think that we're going to fix it tomorrow, but certainly if we're not having these discussions and trying to make the difference, then again, we're not going to, you know, finally achieve what we want with in the end. So it's important that we, you know, we continue to have those discussions going forward.
Great, thank you. I can see we've got 3 minutes left. Let me just scan Suzy whilst, yeah, you start talking. I'm going to look at the last questions.
So just to follow up on that, when it comes to private companies delivering schemes and also running concessions, that's something globally that the IRAP charity has been really quite instrumental in, with concessionaires being held to star rating targets for operation of the routes that they operate. You know, and that's happening all across the world. Certainly, unless you manage that performance and require that level of performance, we are going to achieve that. I wonder as well, when it comes to the sort of more local scene, when it comes to developers, and are we really harnessing the monies that can become available through private development, for example, the 106 and the SIL money that you can get, and put it to really good use. I've got examples from places like King's Lynn where they're using that money to make sure that every child from a development within the city can then access really high star rating routes to school, regardless of where their school is. There's about 10 that is fed from that particular area. So you know, that there are ways and means of putting that sort of thing into planning guidance and documentation, the environmental impact assessment, all of that stuff all needs to have all of this sort of thinking embedded within it for it all to come together.
Great, thank you. So just I think one final question from the floor before we wrap up. So Natalie says, is anyone starting to bring in the next step for safe systems, which Sweden have described as moving beyond zero? So this is around ensuring that mobility and health are integral with design. The idea is that if parents of 12-year-olds would be confident letting their kids use the infrastructure, we have succeeded. But if as a consequence of delivering a scheme, cyclist numbers reduce, it should be seen as a failure, even if you have Vision Zero. I mean, is that a little bit too far down the road for us, thinking about where we are right now, or should that be our starting point?
I think that that's something that's been looked at in Scotland in terms of our national cycle network, and that was the way that what did they look at as a competent user, as a kind of 12-year-old child that could use infrastructure like that. So I think that that's been something that's looked at design. It has been something, I think, that some of the areas have either been removed from the national cycle network or in major major upgrades. But I mean, I think that there should be no curbing our aspirations when it comes to road safety. I think the more that we can do, the more we can aspire to, even although zero deaths and serious injuries on our roads by 2050, the way it looks at this present moment in time looks bleak of actually achieving it. I think that there'll be so much will change in time with technologies and various different bits and pieces, that I think the more aspirational we can be to try and make a difference, because this is people's lives we're speaking about. It's not just, you know, a kind of minor thing. And that's where I think that the more that we can do and push the boundaries across all areas, I think it's useful.
I think that is the perfect way to wrap up. It is exactly 3 o'clock. I think the thinking big, making sure we do everything we can. Perhaps, that's the greatest implication from this survey, is we're having this conversation and we're moving forward and having the discourse. So next week is kind of the what next. So let's take these ideas and kind of see where we can make a difference. But Thank you all so much for those of you who participated, all the questions. We didn't get around all of them. It's been, yeah, the hour has flown by. Thank you very much to Mark, George, Liz and Suzy. Really appreciate your time and your involvement today. And yeah, hopefully see you all again next week. Thank you.